Hello. See, we've still got a few folks trickling in here. Uh, Welcome back. You are still at the Oregon Cyber Resiliency Summit 2024. Thank you for being here. Next, for our 2:45 p.m. Cyber Physical track, we have Chris Schreiber. And Chris is a cybersecurity strategist and advisor, having served as CISO at University of Chicago and the University of Arizona. He has held strategic roles at Mandiant/FireEye and SunGuard, advocating for balanced, pragmatic cybersecurity strategies. Please welcome Chris.
So we'll see if my laptop cooperates. It seems to keep going into power saving mode for some reason. So if it goes blank, it's not over. So real quick, my background, I've been in and around higher education almost my whole career. What's interesting though is I've spent half of it on the vendor side and half in institution leadership roles. So it gives me kind of an interesting perspective when it comes to what's really going on in the cybersecurity technology realm. And that's really what I focus on, is helping people to make the most of their cybersecurity investments. So in this talk, I saw that the theme of the conference was resilience, and I was like, hey, I have a talk I give on cyber resilience, so let's dust it off and go out to Eugene, Oregon, where I've never been before. So this is my first time here, and really great campus. It's a lot of fun to be here. So when you look at cyber resilience, and I usually have a little bit longer deck, and I had to trim the slides quite a bit, and I just realized that one of the slides I trimmed has the resilience model I usually use to describe resilience. So when I think of resilience, I think of a three-legged stool. So on one leg, you want to prevent as much bad stuff as you can. Your second leg, you want to mitigate the damage of the things you can't prevent. And the third, which is usually overlooked, especially when you're talking to vendors, is you need to be able to sustain whatever it is that you've put in place. And so when I'm working with organizations talking about cyber resilience, it's really that three-legged stool concept, and the idea that you have to have all three and they need to be balanced. Otherwise, you're going to have a wobbly stool. And so what we're going to talk about today is really some new analogies about how to describe your cybersecurity program. And hopefully you'll walk out with some ideas about how to talk about it differently in a way that non-technical people can relate to. And so we're going to talk about some of the concepts of resilience. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the current buzzwords that are out there, like zero trust. And then also we're going to talk about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and how you can combine all that to have a discussion about cyber resilience with your stakeholders. So when you think about cybersecurity, it's really evolved. I mean, if you think back 10, 15, 20 years, it was really an afterthought that usually lived in the server administration or network teams, right? And now we have whole departments that are dedicated to security. One of the other shifts is that the nature of the threats we're defending against has become much more sophisticated. So we can't sit back and say we have a firewall in place, we're good, because the attackers are using things like social engineering, phishing, basically trying to find ways to get your users to give them their credentials so they can get in and wreak havoc in your systems and gain access to your data. So the old static approaches to cybersecurity just don't hold up anymore. And so you also need to think about how you shift your descriptions of cybersecurity when you're talking to stakeholders. So who here has heard of defense in depth or uses defense in depth when talking about cybersecurity? I see a lot of hands. I'm going to tell you why I don't like that analogy. And so that's really what we're going to talk about here. So if you think about defense in depth, whether it's castles and moats, or sometimes you see layers of an onion, the main goal of a defense in depth strategy is that if an attacker is trying to get in and they get past one layer, the next layer will stop it. So the whole premise of a defense in depth model for cybersecurity is that you put your most important assets in the middle and you have multiple layers of protection around it. So you want to make it hard for attackers to get to those key assets. There's a couple reasons that I don't like this analogy. One is, if you go back through history, static defenses have never worked. Constantinople stood up for centuries until it didn't. Anytime you look at siege warfare, whoever has a static defense against a mobile adversary, the static defense always loses. And so that's one of the big reasons I don't like using this type of an analogy to talk about cybersecurity, because the adversaries are very adaptive. They will learn more about your environment sometimes than you even know, and find ways to get around your defenses. So one of the analogies I started using several years ago is to think about how a museum protects its assets. And I remember the first time I was talking to a university CISO and I brought this analogy up. He sat back and said, "What are you saying, we're old and stodgy?" I was like, no, let's back up a little bit. Think about what a museum has to do. They have to protect very valuable assets, but they have to do it in such a way that it's easy for the users, the visitors, to come in, to find the assets that they're looking for, to interact with those assets. Think about your role as IT practitioners. You're providing systems for end users to make use of. So if you think about the castle and moat analogy, it's all about outwardly looking, trying to stop people from getting in. If you think about how a museum designs their security, it's about enabling access for authorized users to interact with sometimes the most priceless artifacts that are inside the museum easily and with as little friction as possible. So that's why I don't like using castles and moats to talk about cybersecurity. I think a museum is a much better analogy to explain what we're doing to protect our digital assets, especially when we're explaining it to a non-technical stakeholder. And I actually started using this analogy before Zero Trust really gained ground. But if you think about it, Zero Trust is really promoting the same concepts, right? The only thing I don't like about Zero Trust is it's an unfortunate label, especially in academic settings where people kind of bristle at the idea of don't trust anybody. I would much rather it had been called something like continuous validation, but we're kind of stuck with it. It's won the naming lottery, so to speak. So, but if you think about Zero Trust in museums, it's really that same concept. You want to let authorized people in. You want to continually validate that they really are authorized as they go to interact with your assets. And so when you hear Zero Trust, think of a museum. Think of continuous validation. Think about the language that you're using so that it doesn't cause your users that you're trying to talk to and explain it to kind of bristle and have a negative perception of what you're doing with cybersecurity. How many people are familiar with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework? Excellent. 3 years ago, nobody would have raised their hand. I'm really happy with what they did with the 2.0 version, where they added that new governance layer. I think that was one of the key things that was missing in the version 1 and 1.1. But basically, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, for those not familiar, it's a high-level document that the government and a bunch of academic collaborators, it wasn't just NIST, it was a very broad group of people that put this together. And it's really a very simple model to understand cyber resiliency. And it breaks things down originally into 5 main functions, so identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. In version 2, they added an additional governance layer that they represent as a ring that goes around all of them. So I think this is a great model to use as you're trying to look at your security program at a high level. And I really do like the fact that they've added governance. I think those of us that are from academic settings understand governance kind of inherently as something we're used to when we work in higher education. For people in other verticals, it may not be as strong culturally. But basically, it's about making collective decisions rather than unilaterally pushing decisions out. And so the fact that NIST has added governance into the CSF framework, I think, is a great step forward, and it makes it a lot easier, especially for people in higher education, to actually use that framework when talking about their cybersecurity programs. So what we're going to do here, we're going to take the NIST CSF framework, and we're going to tie it back to the museums. I do have a longer version of this talk I give where I give more examples. We're going to go through it fairly quickly, but if you want more examples, my email address will be at the end. feel free to reach out to me and I'm more than happy to chat more. So we're going to start with identify. And this is really the core for protecting your assets. If you don't know what you're protecting, you can never structure a program to protect those assets. So in a museum, they'll have catalogs of all the resources, all the artifacts, all the displays that they have inside a museum. We need to do the same thing when designing cybersecurity strategies. But the key thing, and this is getting much more accepted, you have to think about your data assets. You don't want to be thinking about the servers or the systems. You want to think about the data that resides or is processed by those servers and systems. How many of you feel like you have a good handle on your data inventory? I don't see any hands. That is not surprising. I see one half hand. It's hard, right? I mean, there's a lot of tools out there that claim they can automate it. If there's one thing that if you're looking at your governance structures and how to address risk management, this is probably the area that you would want to focus the most of your efforts on right now. Especially as people are moving to more and more SaaS and cloud services, your data doesn't live in the data center anymore. So if you think about most organizations, the bulk of their security investment is still going into their firewalls. What are those firewalls actually protecting today? If you're like most of the organizations I work with, you probably have a fraction of your critical data behind those firewalls, and everything else is out in the cloud somewhere. So getting a handle on your data inventory is a really critical first step, because from there you can start designing the controls to protect it. The next step is protect. And so if you think about museums, they'll have layers of defenses around their exhibits. So you might have an additional locked door that you have to come in as a visitor, pay your ticket, walk through to different exhibits. Maybe you have a highly valuable exhibit where there's another guard waiting before you can walk into that room. Here there's a picture of the Mona Lisa, which you can barely see it in the front. There's actually a physical rail separating, and then the bulletproof glass behind that. So they have multiple layers of physical defense around those most critical assets, but they still make it easy for people to go find the Mona Lisa. There's signs and guides that say, oh, it's over here. Go stand behind these other 5,000 people that are waiting ahead of you. That's called the waiting room, right? Anyone using Cloudflare? So when you think about your IT assets, what are the most important things from a protection standpoint today? Anyone?
I mean, you'll want to protect any sensitive data, passwords, credit card information, anything like that. That would probably be what your key data to keep secure.
Yeah, kind of in the right direction.
I mean, it depends on your business model. It could be intellectual property. It could be access to your SCADA network.
Yep. So access, that was the word I was looking for. So protecting your identities and your authentication is probably one of the biggest things you need to invest in. It can be something as simple as having MFA in place, hopefully everywhere. The way I describe it is MFA everywhere and always. I don't know if you're one of the organizations that tends to bypass MFA when you're inside your network. What happens when a host gets compromised inside your network? The bad guys know that those types of rules are in place, right? So MFA everywhere and always. Most attacks still originate with phishing and social engineering. So invest in whatever the best email security that you can afford. That's usually also a very good investment. And really, if you think about it, the firewall is still important, but you have to start thinking beyond the firewall. How are you protecting access to things that live in other people's data centers, up in the cloud, SaaS providers? So you need to start thinking about things like CASB solutions that protect cloud access. There's a lot of new technology that's emerging, SASE and SSE, where it's actually basically acting as a virtual router that routes your users through other people's distribution networks, where it's not even coming back to your main campus anymore. It's going through somebody else's cloud. But you need to start thinking in that direction, because the legacy investments we've made for the last 20 years probably are not protecting the things that you need to be protected the most. The next one is detect. So if you think about a museum, they have sensors and cameras covering almost every square inch, if it's a big museum. You might have a small local museum that doesn't, but if you think like the Louvre, they probably have every square inch of the floor in the Louvre covered by security cameras. We need to be thinking the same way in terms of how we protect our IT infrastructure. We need to have effective monitoring in place, looking for all the different activities of users, network activity. So this is where things like SIM and log aggregation and XDR solutions really start coming into play. The challenge I see for most public sector organizations, whether it's a school or government, those are expensive solutions to buy. So this is probably one of the areas that I see most public organizations really struggle with, just because it is expensive to collect all that data, to analyze all that data. This is one of the areas where AI really does come into play in terms of being more effective. But if you're not collecting the data and you don't store it long enough to actually be able to go back and retroactively inspect something, even having AI is probably not going to be as thorough as it needs to be. So almost every organization I work with, this is one of the areas that they're trying to figure out, how do we move forward. I don't have any great answers for you about how to do it cheaply, because ultimately storing and analyzing data does cost money. But this really is what that detection focuses on. The other key thing is you look at the difference between a museum and a castle. With the old perimeter style of planning your cybersecurity, you were mostly focused on outward attacks. So you were looking out from your environment at attacks that are coming in. With museums, they assume that somebody can get inside. So they're watching for unauthorized or improper use of access. So they assume that you can get inside the environment, and they're watching for all that lateral movement. This is, again, one of the areas where instrumentation and collecting that kind of telemetry in a large environment gets very expensive. So that's why I see a lot of schools struggle with this type of thing, especially when you have tens or hundreds of thousands of devices on your network. These costs do add up fast, but it is about the only way that you can apply this philosophy to protecting your assets. The next is response. So this is assuming that something will get through eventually. There's no such thing as 100% secure. And so when you start looking at response, museums have things like gates that will close automatically, doors that might automatically lock if an alarm gets triggered. I tend to use a fire department analogy here when I'm talking, especially with schools, rather than security guards, but I'm trying to stick with museums. But the key is you want to be able to respond quickly to the things that get through to minimize the damage that occurs. And so you want to have things like tabletop exercises that you hold with all your key stakeholders, both technical and non-technical. So you want to have tabletops with your security team to make sure they understand how to use the tools, how to collect the data they need for forensics. But you also want to extend the tabletops to non-technical stakeholders that need to get brought in if you do have an incident occur. People like marketing, maybe the registrar's office if you have a lot of student data that you need to protect. Making sure that your leadership understands what you're going to do in the event of a security incident, what decisions they're going to be asked to make, and making sure that they're trained ahead of time, because the last time you want to be training your executives about what to do in a security incident is during a security incident. So there's a lot of organizations that will do tabletop training exercises, but the big thing is make sure all the stakeholders understand their roles. Make sure that you have roles and responsibilities well defined and documented, and make sure that you're proactively training them, ideally even doing like annual or quarterly drills where you sit around the table and walk through different scenarios so they can mentally prepare for what decisions they might have to make. Then the fifth area of the NIST framework is recover. So if you think about museums, they'll have things like insurance, they'll have protocols in place to work with law enforcement. We need to do the same thing from a cybersecurity perspective. We want to have very good disaster recovery in place. We want to make sure we test that disaster recovery. I've seen a lot of organizations before the ransomware swell this last few years that had gotten kind of lazy with testing their backups. Server reliability has gotten a lot better. It's not like 20 years ago where backups were something that you had to use regularly just in the process of running IT. And then when ransomware started popping up, people discovered, hey, our backups aren't quite where we thought they were. So make sure that you're testing your disaster recovery, your business continuity plans, evaluate what insurance you might want to pursue. The caveat to that being insurance providers are getting much more strict in what they're excluding. So 5 years ago, cyber insurance used to just pay almost everything. Who's gone through a cyber insurance renewal in the last 12 months? Who has more questions that they've had to answer than they did in the previous 12 months? So the insurance providers are getting very good at identifying questions that they can weasel out of paying if they have to. So it's kind of an interesting dilemma that we're facing, but that's not to say that it's not worth pursuing, but just make sure you understand what it is you've bought as you start looking at those types of programs. And this one is a little hard to see. I need to swap out that image. It's a picture of rain hitting the roof. And this is on a slide talking about communicating metrics. Any guesses what I'm going to say about rain on the roof here? No guesses. One in the back.
It's like falling on deaf ears and you're not absorbing what's coming at you, you're not hearing it. It's just
Close. Except flip it around. So one of the things I see way too often when you look at cybersecurity metrics, we're counting raindrops instead of telling the homeowner if there's a leak in the roof. How many times have you seen cybersecurity dashboards that say we stopped 10 billion attacks yesterday? Another way of describing that is the firewall worked as designed. So a lot of executives I talk to get frustrated when they see these very technical security metric reports because the metrics are real metrics, but they're meaningless when you're talking to a CFO or a president. So think about how you're describing your cybersecurity program. So if you use that raindrop on the roof analogy, as a homeowner, I would want to know, is there a leak? How bad is the damage? How much is it going to cost to fix? How could I have prevented this from happening in the first place? So when you think about how you report your cybersecurity program, think about it from the stance of a home inspector talking about the roof. Are your metrics actually communicating things about your security program in ways that executives are going to care? Most of them do care about security, but they get confused about the metrics that are getting put in front of them and what it is that you're expecting them to do based on those metrics. So things that I tend to look for are mean time to detection, mean time to remediation. These are hard metrics to collect if you're not actually collecting them already in your day-to-day operations processes. But it's worth the time and effort to start steering your metrics in that direction, because then you can talk about how you helped minimize damage, how you helped avoid being on the front page of the paper, and also you can explain that, you know, if we invest X amount of money in this new tool, we can cut the time to detect down here, and here's how that could translate into preventing damage to our organization. So really challenge yourself when you look at your security metrics to think about, am I counting raindrops, or am I talking about the kinds of things that an executive would care about? Don't underestimate the human factor. So this goes to end users as well as technical staff. So I think organizations over the last 5 years have gotten much better at doing security awareness training. But how many of you have dedicated programs to train all of your IT staff in security as it relates to their day-to-day duties? I see one hand. Two hands? Half a hand? So think about like your developers. Are you training them in the OWASP top 10 and what they need to think about from a developer perspective? Your server administrators, how do you harden your systems? Why do you harden the systems? How do you use privileged access management tools? Why are you making them use privileged access management tools? This is probably one of the most cost-effective things you as an IT leader can invest in, is training your IT staff where they become part of your security team, not viewing it as a delegated role for the security people to worry about. And I think we all kind of understand user-centric security matters, where you think about security from the end user perspective. So going back again to the museum analogy, how successful is a museum going to be if there's 10 different gates you have to get through and go through x-ray machines and be searched by guards just to get to the exhibit you're trying to reach? So when you're designing your security controls, think about it from the user perspective. Are you putting an undue burden on the users as they're trying to do their job and interact with the IT assets that you're managing? So definitely always try to keep that user perspective in mind as you're designing your controls, and make sure, bring in test groups. Test different things before you deploy them. Get them in place. You can still have a secure environment, but you can eliminate some of the friction if you design it properly. And then again, just communicate effectively with your stakeholders. Figure out what it is they care about. If you're talking to a researcher, you might want to talk about how their different grants have requirements for cybersecurity. And here's how you can proactively help them apply for a grant in a way that they can say, yes, we have security in place. So think about it from their perspective instead of from your perspective as a cybersecurity leader. If you're talking to somebody in the finance office, being able to talk about risk mitigation in terms of saving dollars and cents. Here's how much a typical breach costs. Here's why we're asking for this investment for cybersecurity. We're hoping to avoid that breach payout cost. So tailor your message, think about your audience. Don't just use the same message over and over. And I just talked about this one, align with institution goals. I think, especially for those of you at universities, research is probably one of the areas where this is most important to think about. I know oftentimes it can feel challenging to interact with faculty, but if you can find how to communicate with them that you're there to help them win their grants, instead of coming in saying, we're going to audit you to see if you're complying with your grant, you're going to have a very different conversation with those PIs. I see somebody's been in that situation, I take it. So just a real quick recap. Move away from castles and moats. I think it's really important to think about analogies for security that are conveying the right picture. If you talk about security with a castle and moat and an attack happens, you're going to be asked, why didn't you build the castle wall higher? If you talk about security as a museum and how you have to be able to protect assets while people can literally walk right up and be inches away from the most valuable thing you own, people have a different perspective about what it is you're trying to accomplish. You need to be adaptable. The adversaries are adapting very quickly. We need to also. Are most people here from universities? Real quick show of hands. Local government? So how many of you are stuck in like 3 or 5 year planning cycles right now? I see one hand. One half hand. The challenge, think about if you have to commit to a 5-year strategy for security and you're expected to not change it, how hard is that to actually create an effective security program with how fast the world is evolving? So be sure that you're setting an expectation where you might have a plan that's published, but maybe you update it every quarter, where you're constantly tweaking it based on emerging best practices, changes in the threat landscape. If you get people used to that and get them used to that tempo, you can have different conversations versus if they're used to you publishing a plan and then there's no changes made to that plan. And that's all I had. My email is there if any of you want more details about some of this, since it was trimmed down a little bit. And I'm not sure how much time we have.
We've got 15 minutes before the next session starts, so technically we're done right now.
Okay.
But 11 format-wise, do you think?
Well, I'll be around. If anyone has questions, feel free to just snag me in the hallway.